quickly getting to be not so new. So as usual, you will have seen in your invitation, our session for today. It's a continuation of our session last Thursday, which was on a healthy metabolism. But today we'll be focusing on one aspect of the area of a healthy metabolism, which is turning out to be quite problematic. So from wherever you are, if you're here on our continent or further afield, it's a warm welcome. And I invite you to relax and take the next 1 hour with us, where we are going to present for you what we have prepared. So as I was saying last week, we have processes that actually lead to an unhealthy metabolism. But before we go into it, I wanted to speak about what happens in a healthy metabolism. This is especially to do with insulin response. So what happens in a normal insulin response? The first thing I wanted to say is that our bodies have to continuously maintain blood glucose levels at a healthy range. And that range is actually quite narrow. So normally, the amount of glucose in all of our blood, that is in the more or less 5 liters of blood that is in our body at any given time, is only 5 grams, which is about 1 teaspoon. That is what should normally be circulating in the blood. The rest of the glucose should be in cells, where it should be preparing and being ready to be turned into energy for use by our cells. So blood sugar is very important because it should be kept very low. And this is why our diet of today have become quite problematic, because we have a lot of added sugar in many foods, as well as refined starch. Refined starch is quickly converted into glucose, and that is why it is seen as part of a problem of blood sugar. So how does the body maintain this narrow balance of blood glucose? I wanted to explain also that I'll be using the word sugar and glucose interchangeably. The form of sugar that we find circulating in our blood is glucose. So when I refer to sugar or I refer to glucose, just take it to be meaning the same thing. Okay, so I was going to say that the way that our bodies maintain this narrow range of glucose or sugar in our blood is by the interplay between two things. One is the continuously sensing the fluctuation of blood glucose. So for example, our body will be able to sense how much glucose is in the blood after a meal, because remember the glucose from our digestion is going to be carried in circulation to its various destinations. Also, it will sense how much is there long after a meal. So how much is there soon after a meal? And also how much is there long after a meal? How much is there, for example, if you're working very hard, there's some kind of exertion, or if we are under stress. All these can change the amount of blood glucose. And so our body has receptors which sense the amount of glucose in the blood. So that is one aspect. The second aspect of the maintenance is the gland called pancreas. So this gland produces enzymes as well as hormones. Today, for our interest, we are interested in two hormones which it produces. These two hormones are important signals for our blood sugar maintaining the right range of blood sugar. So the two are, one is insulin, which I think we are quite familiar with, and the other one is glucagon, less well known. But the two of them are what is referred to as antagonists. That is, one does one thing and the other one does the opposite thing. So and one is produced in one kind of state and the other one produced in a different kind of state. So these two pancreatic hormones increase or decrease blood glucose levels depending on the need. So for example, soon after a meal, when we have plenty of fuel from our digestion, insulin is going to be produced. And the work of insulin is to lower blood glucose by signaling to the cells to take up glucose for their use. So remember, these hormones act as signals. They flow in the blood, they are produced in the pancreas, and then they are injected into the blood, where they go around in circulation, signaling to different cells that there is glucose available and it should be taken up so that the cells are able to get the fuel they need for their energy. So glucose is our major energy molecule. So then soon after a meal, there's plenty of glucose which has been absorbed and it is in the blood. And in response to that, the pancreas is going to increase the amount of insulin in circulation, which will then signal, as I said, to the cells, for example, the muscle cells, to take up the glucose for their use. And to all other cells, it will indicate that maybe for cells which need to be growing, there'll be an indicator for them to take glucose. So generally, to just let the cells know that glucose is available, they should be taking it in. Then the other thing the insulin does is it signals to the liver to convert and store any extra glucose. So once the needs of the cell has been fulfilled, then the signal to the liver is to convert any remaining extra glucose into glycogen and store it in the liver. So glycogen will be made and stored in the liver. Further on, it will also indicate if there is still sugar in circulation, that is, there is still plenty of sugar going around, and the liver has already fulfilled its glycogen storage, then the excess glucose the liver is going to convert it into fat, and this fat is going to be sent into the fatty tissue. The fat cells are going to take it up for storage in the form of fat. So those are the things that insulin does in order to deal with the influx of sugar after we have eaten. Now, let us look at the opposite situation. Several hours have passed since the meal, and now we are in what is called the unfed state, or we have not had food which is providing glucose that is circulating that is being absorbed from the digestive system, sorry. Now, in such a state, the pancreas is not going to produce insulin, it's going to rather produce glucagon. So the glucagon is going to be the one which is circulating in the blood, and it will signal three things. First of all, it will signal the release of stored glucose from the liver. Remember, we say that extra glucose is going to be stored as glycogen in the liver, small amounts of it also in muscle cells. So the glucagon is going to signal for this stored glucose to be released so that we have the energy to go on, even though we haven't eaten. This is why, for example, if we eat at around 10 o'clock, we can be okay until 4, 5, 6, even in the evening. Many parts of our continent, people are not likely to eat more than 2 or 3 times a day. In fact, those who are able to eat 3 times a day tend to be those who are more well off. For most people, it's maybe one main meal and a small meal. And there are people, of course, we know who unfortunately are not even sure of getting that. So after some period of not having taken in food, the hormone glucagon is going to make sure that we still have fuel for producing energy by releasing what we have kept in storage. So apart from the one from the liver, which is not a lot, but it can be released so that it goes into circulation to provide energy. The other thing that glucagon will do is trigger breakdown of stored fat in our cells, or especially in our fatty tissue. So remember, under the signal of insulin, the excess glucose was converted into fat and stored in fatty cells. So now glucagon is going to signal that these fatty cells should release the stored fat into circulation so as to produce energy for us to use. And so another thing it does, the third, inhibits fat storage. So now glucagon indicates that no, we don't need to be storing, we need to be taking what was stored and using it. And you can see if we are thinking, for example, of lowering body weight, if we have become overweight, then this is why one of the recommendations is to give yourself breaks from eating. This is not to starve yourself, but simply not to eat frequently, like having 3 meals and then you have got several snacks, because then glucagon never comes into play. You are always in a fed state. In order for the signal for fat to be removed from storage, we require to be in a state in which the body goes into the storage to get out what is being stored. If we eat frequently, always the body is going to prioritize the glucose that is coming from the digestive system, the one that has just been digested. It is only when this has been used up that we now go into storage, starting with what is stored in the liver, and only after that going to what is stored in our fat cells. So that is what happens when we have got a healthy, normal, insulin sensitive system. So that is a healthy metabolism, and we refer to it as insulin sensitive because it follows the signals given by the insulin. And to support a healthy metabolism, we recommend our 3 products: 3NN for cellular health, botanical balance to help the body to maintain that healthy blood sugar level, and also magnesium, it plays a supporting role. So those are the 3. If you are thinking of generally supporting a healthy metabolism, because maybe as a result of your family background or something else, you might be suspecting that your metabolism is not going so well. So those are the basics for supporting a healthy metabolism. Now we turn our attention to abnormal insulin response. That is when the system is not responding normally the way it should. And this is what we refer to as insulin resistance. So this is one of the processes we mentioned last week of processes that harm our metabolism. And today we'll go more into it because last week we just mentioned it, but today is going to be our main focus. So what exactly is insulin resistance? So as I said, the amount of blood that is supposed to be in our, the amount of sugar that is supposed to be in our blood is quite a small amount, 5 grams for the 5 liter. That is what is normal. That's what should be circulating. All the other glucose should be in cells, and even the 5 grams is in transit. It's being circulated around to find any cell that is in need of it. Now, what happens under insulin resistance, that is the abnormal response to insulin, is that there is a chronic high level of blood sugar, abnormally high level of sugar all the time. What would cause this? What would upset our normal insulin sensitivity so that we go into insulin resistance? There are a number of them. I'll mention a few. The first will be a diet that is rich in sugar and other refined carbohydrates. These ones, when they are digested, they will overwhelm the cells because there'll be a lot of sugar. And when the cells are flooded with sugar, chronically. So remember, this is not that maybe on Christmas Day you decide to carve a big chunk of chocolate cake or some ice cream or something like that. These problems tend to be chronic, and that is why we call them chronic diseases, because the exposure is not once off. We keep on having the exposure. So keep that in mind so that we do not overreact, but we realize that we cannot form these habits of having too much refined carbohydrates in our diet because they produce too much glucose too quickly. And that means that there's a flood of glucose into the blood circulatory system, which is now going to cause the insulin to struggle to send the glucose to all the needed parts because we have more than what we need. So if this continues chronically, that is the flood of refined carbohydrate foods, eventually the parts of the cells, so our cells, all our cells have receptors, a place in the cell which is sensitive and responds to the signal from the insulin. If we are continuously giving this signal, what will happen is that the receptors are going to get damaged and they will stop responding to the signal from insulin correctly. The result is going to be that the cells and the biochemical pathways that are involved in sugar metabolism stop responding the way they should, the way we have described in the previous section. So that is one cause. The second cause is stress. So we, of course, have got a standalone session about stress where we'll go more deep into it. But for now, just to mention that chronic stress also keeps the flood of stress hormones. We have got specific hormones that are produced when we are stressed. One of them is called cortisol, and the other one is called adrenaline. I think adrenaline is more well known because it's the one that is produced when we are under a certain kind of attack. But cortisol is produced when we are having a chronic type of stress. That is a low-grade stress that goes on, and we are powerless to get rid of it. So these hormones are going to be released into circulation to deal with the stressor, whatever it might be. Once the stressor has been dealt with, the hormones dissipate and we go back to normal. However, if we have chronic stress, that is stress which is not just an isolated event, like for example, I've gotten a fright or I've gotten an injury that maybe I need to attend to, or there is an emergency in the house which needs to be dealt with. That type of stress is short-lived because we deal with it and then everything returns to normal. On the other hand, if I have chronic stress, like for example, in a difficult relationship, a job where things are not going well for me, or maybe something else of that sort, then there's going to be a chronic flood of these stress hormones. And what happens is that the body is going to keep on producing a flood of glucose in response, because these stress hormones instruct the pancreas to produce more insulin so that the insulin can bring into play the addition of glucose to the blood. So that continuous addition of glucose to the blood to deal with the stress is going to be chronic, which means that the blood glucose is going to be chronically high. That is another reason why we can have insulin resistance. The other one is obesity. So if we have put on a lot of weight as a result of maybe our eating habits or our sedentary lifestyle, then the overfilled fat cells. So remember, the obesity comes from fat cells which have been filled with extra glucose that is being put into storage. So when this happens, and we continue to keep on taking in these high refined carbohydrate foods and sugars and so on, the fat cells are going to be full. And when they are full, what they will do is start causing inflammation, because that fatty tissue is not just for storage, it is also able to produce its own types of molecules, and these are inflammatory molecules. So they increase inflammation, chronic inflammation. And we'll speak about inflammation in the next session, but just to be aware that obesity is the cause of inflammation. And that inflammation is going to also cause insulin resistance. Then the last thing I'll mention here is leaky gut and autoimmunity. When our intestinal walls are damaged, there tends to be a possibility for incompletely digested food to pass through and go into blood circulation. The only things that should enter blood circulation are those molecules of completely digested food. If there is food that has not been properly digested in the blood, what happens is that our immune cells is going to mistake them for harmful germs getting in the system, and they will react as if we have an infection. That is what we call an autoimmune reaction. That is when our body is not reacting to a harmful invader from outside, but actually reacting to something within the body, or actually a tissue of the body. If this autoimmune reaction continues, the immune system becomes so stressed that it starts to react against even normal tissues. You can have reactions against the skin, where you have something like psoriasis. You can have reactions against air passages. Then you have some of these chronic respiratory problems and so on. So those are four of the various causes of insulin resistance. But now let us move on to the next session, where I want to mention the results of impaired insulin response. What happens as a result of this insulin response becoming abnormal? The first is that blood glucose remains chronically high because of those things that are causing it. The next is that greater insulin production takes place in the pancreas. So the thing is that when we don't respond, when our body notices that we are not responding to the insulin, it's going to assume that we don't have enough insulin. So the pancreas is going to be signaled to produce even more insulin. And that means that apart from having a lot of abnormally high glucose in the blood, we are also going to have abnormally high insulin circulating in the blood chronically. So now the insulin is always in the blood. And this also is going to suppress the production of the other hormone, the glucagon, which we mentioned, works in opposition to insulin. Then over time, as the pancreas keeps on overproducing this insulin, of course, it is also going to be exhausted and it will become incapable of producing enough insulin for our needs. And then that is going to worsen things for us. So what are some of the early signs we can notice that our insulin response is not as good as it should be? Maybe it's becoming defective. And these signs can actually be noticeable even while our blood glucose itself, if we have it measured, remains normal. So one of the first warning signs that all is not well with our insulin response will be high blood pressure. We know that high blood pressure is one of the common problems that people come to us for supplements because it is called the silent killer. The reason it's called that is because we go to our doctor and we get medication and we keep on going back and getting a refill of the medication and we learn to live with it, unfortunately not realizing that it is the initial indicator of a more serious problem. So how does insulin resistance bring about high blood pressure? So when we have that high insulin circulating in the blood that I've just mentioned, it is going to signal to the kidney so this is high insulin signaling to the kidney to retain more sodium. And when we retain more sodium, we also retain more water to dilute the sodium. This is why, for example, when you have high blood pressure, your medical practitioner will probably tell you to lower your salt intake because your kidney is now keeping a lot of sodium, and so you are having a higher sodium than should be normal. Unfortunately, taking less salt is not dealing with the root of the problem. And so rather than of course, do lower your salt intake, especially if you're taking a lot of salt, or if you are eating the type of food that has already got salt added to it. A lot of snacks have got a lot of salt added to it already. So it's not within your power to change the amount. So the best thing is to reduce the amount of those types of food. Rather prepare or opt for foods where you can determine how much salt you put in. So when we start retaining more sodium and therefore more water, we are going to end up with swelling up. So you may notice swelling in the ankles, swelling in the fingers, a puffiness maybe around the eyes. That is telling you that there is more fluid in your body than there should be, and that is what is causing the puffiness. And this also means that your heart has to work harder. So your blood pressure has to be higher because it is dealing with more fluid. This fluid is in circulation in your blood. The other thing that happens is that this chronic high level of circulating insulin also leads to two problems to do with our blood vessels. That is, it is going to cause the blood vessels to stiffen. So instead of being soft and flexible, they are going to start becoming stiffer. In addition to that, they are going to constrict. That is, they are going to become narrower. These are effects of circulating insulin, and these also contribute to high blood pressure. So just be aware and do give this information to people who come to you with high blood pressure, that there could be a possibility that they need to look at their diets and watch their refined carbohydrate intake. They rather should opt for high fiber carbohydrates and maybe even lower the amount of carbohydrates in their diet. Then the other sign, so the first is high blood pressure. The second one is skin tags. You may have noticed in some people, maybe in yourself, or people with diabetes, that they tend to have little balls on their skin, like pimples, but they almost look as if you can pluck them off. So they tend to be in places where there are skin creases, like around the neck or around the elbow, and so on. So these are called skin tags, and also they are accompanied by darkening skin. Of course, if you're dark skin, such as myself, it might not be so noticeable, but in lighter skinned people, you may notice that those areas where there are skin creases, the skin is getting dark and looking leathery, almost like it's shiny and darkening, darker than the other parts of the adjacent parts of the skin. So this happens because the high sugar in the blood circulation is causing cells to proliferate, and those excess cells are the ones that form the skin tags. So that is another warning. If you notice that there's skin creases on your body, maybe your neck, maybe around your groin and your elbows, armpits, and so on, are beginning to be darker and darker. And especially if you notice skin tags also forming on those areas, it is an indication that your insulin response is becoming defective. Another one, of course, is if you have a close family member who has type 2 diabetes, some of these vulnerabilities run in families, so it could be an indicator. If you notice some of these other things, that you need to watch out for possibilities of insulin resistance. Another early warning of defective insulin response occurs in men where they have ED, erectile dysfunction, which is because of those effects of high insulin in the blood that lead to impaired circulation. Because the blood vessels are constricted and stiff, then the blood is not flowing as it should. And of course, also, if you have got high blood pressure and you're taking medication for it, it lowers the blood pressure, including the blood pressure that is required to hold or maintain an erection, and that means the medication itself for high blood pressure can contribute to this. The other sign is migraines. So one of the reasons for migraines is that insulin resistance can interfere with energy production in the brain, and that can lead to chronic inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain, which is one of the things that can lead to migraines. And lastly is chronic low-grade inflammation. If you are inflamed, this chronic type of inflammation, then it can also be an indicator that you have your insulin response is becoming impaired. So now we'll go on to look at some of the thing that I've been describing as chronic systemic inflammation. I very often use this term. I'm sure you've had it used in many places and in books and information about chronic disease, because as we stand now, the World Health Organization has said that chronic systemic inflammation is the greatest threat to human health and the most significant cause of death worldwide from chronic disease. So it is quite serious, and it is not caused by infections. It is caused by our lifestyle habits and our diet. So we look at a few points about it. The first is to just describe chronic inflammation as an alarm that never goes on. Maybe you know those houses where they've got an alarm system which is supposed to alert the people in the house that there is an intruder. Now you can imagine an alarm goes off. That is the same thing as chronic inflammation. It's an alarm system to alert our body that there is a problem somewhere. But because it is systemic, the body might not be able to identify exactly where the problem is. And also, since it is chronic, it means that the body is continuously on red alert, as if there is an emergency immediately. So, unfortunately, the other signs of chronic inflammation are a bit vague. They might not be clearly identified as chronic inflammation, because one of them is chronic fatigue, that you are always feeling tired even though you have had a good rest and you have had a meal, but you still feel tired. That can be a sign of chronic inflammation. Another one is brain fog, where you find that you are unable to concentrate and you are forgetful and your mind is not as sharp as it should be. That can be an indicator. It can also be indicated by multiple food sensitivities, that different types of food, almost every kind of food has got a bad effect on your digestion. Or you may have, or foods may cause bloatiness or puffiness. All these can be a sign of this systemic inflammation. So the main causes of it, of course, will be insulin resistance. And I find it difficult to be able to pinpoint whether we get the insulin resistance first and then we have the inflammation, or we have the inflammation first and then it leads to insulin resistance. However, the two of them tend to reinforce each other. So if you have inflammation, it reinforces the insulin resistance. And if you have insulin resistance, it reinforces the inflammation. Another cause of inflammation is when our mitochondria are not functioning well. We mentioned this last week. Also, if our hormone signals are not being responded to well, this we have mentioned in the previous section. Leaky gut and autoimmune issues, we also have mentioned, can also lead to chronic inflammation, as well as high intake of factory oils. Remember those oils that I often speak about, which are made in factories from foods which have got supposed to have very little oil in them, such as cotton seeds or from maize and so on. So for systemic inflammation, we recommend that you use omega-3 plus, because that helps in resolving inflammation. We also recommend flavonoid complex, vitamin A plus D. And remember, because there may be insulin resistance involved here, then botanical balance will also be useful there. Then another effect will be on our liver. So the liver, we have spoken fairly frequently, is one of the questions we get in the Q&A, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So this is where there is insulin resistance in the liver cells. So the liver cells are not responding correctly to insulin. This makes the liver convert glucose into fat and store it within itself. So it converts, it just keeps on converting glucose into fat and storing it. And the liver is not supposed to contain a lot of fat, which means that if it is keeping all this glucose in itself in the form of fat, you're eventually going to have a fatty liver. And if this goes on, then there's going to be liver damage, also what is called liver cirrhosis. Remember that there used to be liver disease, which was caused by alcohol, excessive use of alcohol, but the majority of the liver disease today is caused by excessive blood sugar from taking too much refined carbohydrates in our diet. Again, here, the lifestyle point is to opt for better quality carbohydrates, that is fiber-rich carbohydrates in managed amounts, that is not too much, so that we do not have a large amount of sugar flooding around in circulation. So to support our liver, we can recommend flavonoid complex, we can recommend botanical balance, as well as beta-GAD. Then another area I wanted to mention is the effects of insulin resistance on fat cells. So remember, fat cells are storage places. The fatty tissue is where we store our extra fat. And of course, it is good to have storage, especially because sometimes we may have a food shortage. Also, the fatty tissue keeps our body temperature maintained at the right level. It keeps us warm in cold weather and so on. So fat is not our enemy, but when we have too much of it, then it leads to health issues. And too much of it comes not from eating too much fat, but from eating too much refined carbohydrate in our diet. Because these refined carbohydrates will be converted into glucose. That glucose is an excess and is going to be converted into fat, the fat which is going to be stored in fat tissues, and the fat tissues are going to be full. Once those fat cells are full, they start breaking down the stored fat and releasing it into the blood. It should not be there except in very tiny amounts. So once our fat cells are breaking and releasing stored fat into the blood, we are going to end up with fatty blood. And when we have fatty blood, it causes more inflammation. It also worsens insulin resistance, so it feeds into the problem of insulin resistance, reinforcing it. It also increases the formation of plaque, which damages our blood vessels. And also it can lead to inflammation in the pancreas itself. So then the pancreas is going to have another source of problems. And this also, of course, will worsen inflammation and in turn worsen insulin resistance. So a lifestyle point about overfilling our fat cells will be to eliminate snacks from our lifestyle and use time-restricted eating. That is, eat only during meals at specific times. You can decide how many times a day you eat. It can be 2 times or 3 times. Most probably it's not recommended that you eat more than 3 times a day. You can look at your portion sizes so that you don't eat more than you need. If you have a sedentary job, then your energy intake should be in line with your low activity. If let's say you used to be a sports person and very active, and now you are no longer so active, you cannot go on eating the same way you're eating when you are very active. We should center our diet around healthy proteins and fiber-rich carbohydrates. And also we should increase movement and exercise so as to encourage our pancreas to produce glucagon, and the glucagon is going to open up the stored fat for use. This does not mean we should starve ourselves. We should be sensible about spacing our eating and managing our portion sizes. Of course, I'm saying this to you, but I'm also saying it to myself. I think those maybe who know me know I've had a very long time struggle with body weight, and I'm sure many of us are in this struggle. We can never give up because many aspects of our health depends on maintaining a healthy body weight, especially around our abdomen. Then I think the next thing I will mention here will be the kidneys, the effects of insulin resistance on the kidney. So when there is high circulating glucose and high circulating insulin, the kidney, as I said before, is instructed to retain more sodium and therefore retain more water. And this high glucose in the blood is going to damage the filtration units of the kidney. So the kidney has got many, many little units that are involved in filtering blood. In fact, the kidney filters our blood 60 times in a 24-hour cycle. That is a lot of work. So every 24 hours, our blood goes to the kidney 60 times. And that is why when our kidney starts not functioning, we need dialysis machine to do the work of the kidney because it's a very hard working organ. And so if we have got too much glucose in the blood, it leads to damage of blood vessels And some of the blood vessels which are vulnerable will be those in the kidneys because they are very small. This same damage is going to happen in our eyes. That is why, for example, people with diabetes end up losing their eyesight. It's going to affect the blood vessels in where we may find that we are not able to heal our injuries, let's say in our feet and so on. So to support our kidneys, we need to make sure we have beta-GAD and flavonoid complex and multimineral alfalfa. So again, I'm saying these things as the different ways in which insulin resistance will manifest itself or cause problems. So it will not necessarily be the same in everyone. For me, it might make me obese. For another person, it might lead to kidney problem. For a third person, it could lead to diabetes and so on. So that is why I'm giving recommendation depending on the area that we are talking about. Then I think the last one that I will, maybe the last two I'll mention will be the brain. So insulin resistance interferes with the brain's glucose supply and can be a contributor to brain fog, sorry. And if we continue with those problematic habits, then it can contribute to inflammation, damage to our mitochondria, and eventually contribute to dementia. So one of the things that are linked to dementia is high blood glucose and high insulin. And that is why sometimes it is spoken of as a type of the diabetes of the brain. So do be careful about this because as you can see, it will affect maybe organs which you normally don't think about. But once something starts to touch our brain and our eyes, we really have to take notice. And then the other area will be damage to the nerves in our extremities. For example, we can start having a lot of pain in our fingers and joints. And this is because the excess sugar will be damaging to our nerves. And finally, insulin resistance will also have an effect on our reproductive organs. I already mentioned ED, but in women, it will also manifest as polycystic ovarian syndrome, and this can contribute to infertility. So if you have PCOS, then know that it is a way in which insulin resistance is manifesting itself. And so you should use botanical balance, herbal feminine complex, multimineral alfalfa, and maybe Provitality or TreeNN, depending on your budget. So I've gone on quite a bit today because this tends to be a long topic. But just to be aware that insulin resistance is our warning that we are headed towards pre-diabetes or even to type 2 diabetes. And therefore, when we notice those points that I mentioned of the early signs that your insulin response is becoming impaired, I think we should not even wait to that point. Now that we have the information, we should immediately assess our lifestyle and our diet and rather change our carbohydrate choices so that we have ones which are rich in fiber, maybe reduce the quantity that we take. And also we can look at the amount of activity in our lifestyle and see how we can increase the activity. One thing that really helps with making us insulin sensitive is doing some activity after meals, because that signals to our system that we should not be storing the absorbed glucose. What we should be doing is using it so that it is not stored in our fat tissues, which eventually get too full. Also, we should look at our activity so that we see if we cannot increase our activity, we definitely should not be putting in a lot of fuel foods, which are going to just be stored in the form of fat. So thank you very much for now. I'm sure that was a handful. Next week, we shall be having a Q&A. Quite a bit of it will be about questions related to our metabolism. But I invite you for any questions. There are already questions that we have received that we'll have next week. But for now, I want to thank you very much for having taken the time. And as always, Pascal is here beside me, waiting to take you through the next session. Have a very good evening and thank you.
Thank you very